I don't think I've seen a musical in a really long time that has had such a drastic different reaction from people than Cruel Intentions has. I have seen people think it's a 1-star show. I have seen people think it's a 5-star show. This musical, based on the cult classic film Cruel Intentions, has taken the film and musicalized it with different songs from the 90s. So, am I on the 1-star side? Am I on the 5-star side? Let's find out. But if you haven't seen my face before, hi, I'm Ellie. I talk about theatre. I am the most chaotic theatre person on the internet. I do reviews, I do discussions, I do video essays, and if any of that's interesting to you, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It really helps me out, helps out the channel. But let's dive into Cruel Intentions. Now, as someone who hasn't seen the original film, Cruel Intentions, I can really understand from watching this show why it has the reputation that it has. It's one of those films that people often describe as so bad that it's good. And so a lot of the approach that this musical takes does make a lot of sense with that in mind. It's campy, it's over the top, it's kind of ridiculous how it shoved this music in. However, I just don't think it worked for me personally. Act 1, I found really tough to get through. And I think one of the key reasons for this is these protagonists. These characters are not good people. And I think an unlikable protagonist needs to be taken in one of two different ways. You either need to start them being unlikable and slowly you redeem them for a story, or you make them unlikable, but there's something interesting about how bad they are, about how evil or disturbed they are, that it makes you intrigued about them. It makes you want to know more about them. You want to see how far they will take this. Cruel Intentions feels like it's going for the latter, especially in Act 1. But I don't find these characters very interesting. They're just kind of doing awful things, but they're so reserved and there's so little going on behind the eyes that I'm not really interested in watching them leading this story. I'm not intrigued to why they're doing this. I just think they're awful people. Now, I think Act 2 works better for me because they do start to redeem Sebastian in a sense. He starts to wane on his beliefs. He starts to find himself second guessing what he's doing. And because of that, I could actually start to latch onto him as a character. If they showed more hints of this, if they started to seed these ideas in Act 1, I feel like I would probably come out of this show a lot more positive than I am. And the most annoying thing is that beyond these two lead characters, the rest of the characters aren't fleshed out enough for me to even latch onto them either. The closest we get is the love interest, Annette, who's played by Abby Budden in this production. And yeah, there's moments where you get to know her as a character, but because the show treats her as like a conquest for Sebastian, we're not really spending enough of the time getting to know her. There's Cecile, who's quite innocent and naive, and that does lead to some nice moments, but again, I'm not really getting a sense of who she is. And don't get me started on how underwritten the two gay characters are. So with a lack of strong characters, I can't really latch on to anyone amongst this really strange and fairly dark plot. As I said, Act 2 works more, because then I can actually get a latch onto Sebastian as a character. When you start actually asking these questions, when you actually start to go into this and go, what happens to this morally apprehensive character when he starts to actually fall in love with someone, it actually becomes a lot more interesting. There's questions for me to latch onto. There's things for me to actually engage with. Whereas the start of the show, Act 1, feels like there's not really much for me to think about. There's no meat on these bones there. And beyond that, I don't think the show is even camp enough to make that lack of substance okay. You can tell this cast is trying and they do a good job, but it feels like a lot of the music is doing the heavy lifting into the campness side of things and to push for that so bad it's good vibe. When actually, I do think when watching this, there is probably a good story somewhere here. I think this musical's biggest flaw, though, is the music. I think that this show needed an original score. I think the only thing, and I will give it its credit for this, the only thing that this style of music and what they've gone for does well is that it sells the camp factor. It's silly. It's not taking itself seriously, and you can tell this when it's breaking into songs like No Scrubs or going into a Spice Girls number. You know, this is silly. It's silly to a T, and this audience really, really fell in love with that. I struggled a lot more. And I think I struggled mostly because not a single one of these songs felt like it worked where it was placed. It felt like with almost every song that the actual song was just getting in the way of the story, which is probably the biggest sign that this jukebox musical is not working. Take some other jukebox musicals, for example. Something like Tina or Ain't Too Proud. These musicals retell the story of the artist, so it feels natural that they're bursting into their own songs. These songs are used to build that emotion, to show you where they are in their life, and a lot of the time, these artists put so much of themselves into their music that it just feels natural to put them into this show. You have that flow already, you have that excuse to go into the music. On the other hand, take something like & Juliet or Mamma Mia. You have this long list of songs and you mold the story around them. You're not trying to force it in anywhere. You're taking these songs and you're making sure these moments work for it because they're being written for that. Cruel Intentions kind of finds itself being the worst of both worlds. It's got this pre-existing music that it's trying to put into a pre-existing show. So when you're trying to put these two things together, it becomes a lot clearer when the jigsaw pieces aren't matching. So much so that I was finding myself groaning whenever they would go into a song. It was getting in the way of the actual story, and we were just sitting there for about 2-3 minutes until we could actually get something that would further the plot. These songs didn't really do a very good job at telling the emotion. They didn't really match what the characters were feeling in that moment. It felt like we were just having to wait for about 3 minutes until we could actually get on with the show. Thank God these performances are like really, really good. So you actually do get an enjoyable performance of these songs. Still, if I could choose having these amazing performers perform some original music that actually feels like it has a purpose to this story, then I would rather go with that than have this be a musical at all. It works for the campness of it, it works for the silliness of it, I guess. But I think a lot of the book is taken seriously enough that it still feels quite jarring. I think your enjoyment of this show is going to be very much dependent on how much you can switch that brain off. If you can switch that brain off and you love a bit of 90s music, you love that style and that vibe, and you're a big fan of this film, and, you know, you can kind of take it as what it is, I feel like you can be a lot more forgiving of some of these elements. But for me, who has no nostalgia for that film, who isn't really much of a fan of 90s music, or at least the selection of 90s music that they have in this show, it's very clear that it doesn't feel like what it's good at is designed for me. And then a lot more of the cracks and the flaws are kind of exposed. What I do quite like is the design of this show, especially this set. I think this set works on the Other Palace stage. I really enjoy the revolve that they used. I love the stark black walls with that skyline up above. I love how this is used for different levels and to really get some dynamic staging in. I love the slightly raised level that kind of borders the entire stage. With this theatre stage being in a thrust, I think it's really nice, and they use it for characters walking across or like to give a different level. I think it's an interesting idea. And I think especially when they crack out like the neon lighting and the LEDs, it adds a nice little element to the lighting design of this show that does keep it visually interesting. But what I don't think worked for this show visually was a lot of its choreography. It felt like every single song had a very different style of choreography, and it didn't really gel very well. It felt a little bit messy in places, and sometimes even distracted from the songs that they were singing. On the whole with this show, I'm very mixed. I think it has its moments where it works, and especially in Act 2, I was a lot more on board with it when it actually finds itself becoming a bit more grounded. And when it finally does that, when it finally shows Sebastian with a different elements to his character, it's really interesting. It's really intriguing. But there's so much there that just doesn't really click for me. The music and its placement doesn't feel right. I'm not really engaged with these characters at all. And I found myself finding it hard to just kind of let go and enjoy the campness of it. But I think that when we're talking about this show, this cast are really, really strong. Daniel Bravo plays Sebastian. He is a absolute piece of work. If we're talking about this briefly, he is not a good person. He knows he's not a good person, and he's kind of proud of that fact. But when he starts to go on his next, as he would call it, conquest to sleep with Annette, he kind of finds himself falling in love with her and finds himself with a certain softness towards her. When we start to get that in Act 2, it's really interesting. I feel like Bravo does a really good job at kind of showing us how he's softening and how his morals are slightly changing. He has some really great chemistry with Budden, and it's nice to watch. Rhiannon Louise Mikulski is the star of this show, though. I'm less convinced with her character, but I feel like there are moments, especially in Act 2, where we get the full breadth of her bitchiness. Her character doesn't get a redemption arc like Sebastian, but because of the conflict that these characters start to have, her character becomes more interesting as a result. And when I say vocals, I mean vocals. Mikulski absolutely kills it with every single song she is given. She gets an absolutely show-stopping number at the end of Act 2 that just, even if I was sitting there struggling with this show, that was undeniably incredible. Abby Budden plays Annette. Again, I wish the show developed her character a little bit more, but she's a really nice presence in the show. She works as a nice foil to Daniel Bravo's character of Sebastian. And I like how they change each other in different ways. I like how they play off of each other. Rose Galbraith as Cecile is a nice presence. I like how she's the most innocent character, kind of wrapped up in this really weird and dark show, and she sells this element to it. I feel like I would like to see her character get a more standout musical number in this show, though. Josh Barnett and Barney Wilkinson played two stereotypical gay characters. You have the one very openly gay character, and oh no, it's the jock who's secretly gay. It's like, I've seen this before. I've seen this before a million times, and it does come off as very stereotypical. And the show doesn't spend enough time on these characters to actually flesh them out as characters. So their presence in the show does feel a little bit weaker by default. But that's not to say that they don't give good performances. Their standout moment definitely being their Spice Girls number. But if there's one performer in this show who just kind of understands the assignment, leans directly into the camp, it's Jess Buckby as Miss Caldwell. I wasn't sold by the choice of song that she gets, but I can't lie. The way that she goes into it, she understands the assignment, she understands what this show is, and she leans fully into it. Honestly, if there's any show that was going to get a reaction like Cruel Intentions has, I can understand why it's this one. This is a show that has a very drastically different reaction depending on who you are and what you bring to this show. If you love the film, if you're ready for something silly and camp and a little bit dark that you're not going to take very seriously, then I feel like you're going to get more out of Cruel Intentions. But I think what upset me was just seeing that potential, seeing them start to lean into stuff in Act 2 that I felt like was working a lot more. It feels like I had to wait for a very long time to get what I wanted out of Cruel Intentions. And I wonder whether this is a show that would have worked better with an original score. If you were to ask me a star rating for this show, which I don't often do, I feel like it would probably be a lower 3-star show. Personally, for me, Cruel Intentions didn't work, but I think it's very obvious to see elements of this that could work for other people. So would I recommend it? I think it's going to be very much up to you. I'd recommend watching the film first. But what do you think? Have you seen Cruel Intentions? Which camp are you in? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know all of your thoughts in the comments down below. If you did enjoy this video, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It really helps me, it helps out the channel. Here's some links to my videos on screen right now, and a link to my Instagram if you want to drop me a follow over there. But that's it for me today, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!